The cotton gin impacted all regions of the United States and tied them closer together. You'll recall from the earlier chapters, the nation was relatively disconnected in terms of reliance on one another. But with the invention of the cotton gin, what we see is that because southern plantations are able to produce more and more cotton and have that cotton seeded and sent to a place to be spun into cloth, they're able to produce more, so they continue to produce more. As a result of that, we see that the nation becomes more tied together through this industry. The demand for cotton in the northern mills meant that an expanding cotton agriculture in the South. At the same time, we see that Western farmers feel increased pressure to produce food for both the North and the South. The northern climate isn't really hospitable for a lot of food production, but they've also invested most of their efforts to industrialize into mills. The South certainly did historically grow some food items, but not enough to sustain a nation. But the climate of the South was such that cotton could be produced relatively easily, and there was enough land to do that. And so, with massive slave labor and now this cotton gin, which makes it easier to separate the cotton from the seeds, we see that that kind of becomes the natural industry and commodity for the South. So the nation as a whole becomes dependent on one another. If you remove any of those aspects, then it becomes very difficult for the nation to survive. So while you don't see the number of slaves in the West that you see in the East, and you certainly see far more slaves in the South than in the North, the entire nation as a whole is benefiting in some way, directly or indirectly, from slave labor. Now, I want to talk just a moment about the short staple cotton versus the long staple cotton. So, these are two different types of cotton that can be grown and then sent to those different mills. Now, here you have an image of some long staple cotton, and it's a little bit easier to separate these hulls or husk type things from this long staple cotton. Long staple cotton is the fabric is a little less exposed and it actually has a stronger thread. So if you've ever slept on a sheet with a high thread count, it's very likely that long staple cotton was used to produce that. Now, long staple cotton is a little more labor intensive in terms of caring for it. It doesn't just grow anywhere. And it doesn't grow as quickly as the short staple cotton. So the short staple cotton here, which is what you'll see in fields along the side of the road, all through most of the South, certainly around here in Montgomery County, and it looks like this. Now, if we look back at this picture, it's pretty easy to separate this part of this kind of hull and pull out the seed and take this cotton and go ahead and send it off to be spun. But here with this short staple cotton, we see that this hull is kind of embedded in the center, and it's actually on these edges as well, all the way around, where it's like a pocket that protects the cotton. And then each of these little parts of the cotton ball here will also have a seed inside of them. And so this short staple cotton is much easier to grow. and it's much easier to grow in a climate like, the agricultural South, but it is much more labor intensive. It has to be picked and then it has to be separated. And these little pieces here, I know they're a little bit hard to see, they're very sharp. And so as you're separating the cotton, you can prick your finger, and so that will cause bleeding. And so it's a very, very labor intensive crop. But the efforts of the cotton gin made this process a little bit easier. So now slaves would need to pick the cotton, and the cotton gin would do most of the separating work, and then slaves would, pull that cotton together and have it sent off to wherever it would need to be sent to be sold. And so this is a really important thing to understand when we talk about the way that things are changing in the South with this increase in cotton production, and how things are getting more difficult to separate the regions of the now United States. Now, while the cotton gin reduced one aspect of slave labor, meaning that slaves did not need to do the separating, it ultimately quashed any ideas or any hopes of abolition because it increased the demand for cotton, which in turn increased the need or the demand for slavery in the South, as plantation owners quickly began to expand their land holdings so that they could plant more and more cotton. As a result of the increased demand for cotton, slave populations grew. Domestic trade, illegal smuggling from Africa or the Caribbean, and natural diseases, and natural increase, all contributed to an increase in the number of slaves in the United States. Between 1790 and 1820, the number of slaves increases from about 700,000 to 1.5 million, and the price of individual slaves doubled between 1795 and 1805. So two important consequences of this invention and the expansion of cotton is that the number of slaves more than doubles, and the price of slaves doubles as well, which means that there's money to buy slaves if people are continuing to buy slaves, even though the fees are higher than they had been in the past. Cotton's expansion throughout the South and into the West required additional lands and expanded slavery into new regions, including Indian lands. The Creek and the Cherokee Indians adapted to cotton cultivation and even purchased slaves. So again, the nation as a whole is complicit in slavery. Slaves were an important element of the South's geographical expansion, but moving west frequently broke up slave families. Slaves who were forced to move to new plantations employed various methods to slow down production and limit their owners' control, ranging from running away to purposely breaking tools. Planters' increased dependency on slaves, coupled with the elimination of the slave trade, provided slaves with a limited amount of leverage, ensuring, for example, better food to prolong slaves' productivity. The increase in slave populations also led to more extensive slave kinship networks. The religious revivals that marked the American society at the time were also seen in slave and white frontier communities. Camp meetings provided opportunities for different groups to find limited release from their day-to-day burdens. Religious revivalism and revolutionary ideas regarding freedom inspired different slave rebellions, as in Virginia in 1800, when Gabriel, a slave, plotted to kill all white supporters of slavery. Although informants betrayed Gabriel to the white authorities before he could execute his plan, news of this plot reminded white Southerners of the potential dangers surrounding slavery. That brings you to the end of chapter 8.